All right, while we're waiting for the second bell to ring, be opening your Bibles to the book of Habakkuk, or Habakkuk's prophecy. And we're starting our studies in our material we've chosen for this quarter. We'll look at Habakkuk's prophecy tonight, the Lord willing, this coming Sunday, and then we'll finish up, the Lord willing, again next Wednesday. So we have 3 classes devoted to Habakkuk. I hope you're enjoying these classes. These are books that I find interesting to study because we don't usually deal with them that much. I'm not accusing anybody of that, of anything by saying that. I just, you don't hear many sermons from Habakkuk or Nahum or Haggai. There's good preaching in these books. So I hope you're finding these studies profitable as we look at some of the minor prophets. All right, so here's the list we've been showing. The ones that's highlighted in yellow, that's the 8 that Brent and I chose for this quarter. And we've already looked at 5, Obadiah, Joel, Jonah, Nahum, and Haggai. So that just leaves these 3. So tonight we're looking at Habakkuk. And then after that we'll do Micah. Brent will cover the Micah studies, and then I'll finish up the quarter by looking at Malachi. So that's where we are on our schedule. As you know, I like to do when I take my turn in these studies, I like to talk about some other things as best we can determine about the prophet before jumping right into the text. So let's talk something about Habakkuk or Habakkuk. I prefer Habakkuk. Habakkuk the man. His name meant embrace. And like I said, I think time before last, sometimes the name of the prophet would have a sort of underlying meaning to the theme of the book, sometimes not. And I'm not saying that this is 100% so, but if you think about his name meaning embrace, and you know something about the book, what it teaches, especially in the first chapter, Habakkuk did embrace the cause of justice that he saw a lack of in Judah. He complained to God about all this wickedness and unrighteousness, and so he took up the cause of justice. When were you going to do something about all this that I'm seeing that's just wrong? So that may be the case. And he also took to heart, or he embraced the cause of his brethren when he got this first answer, which we'll look at tonight, about when he questioned God, how long are you going to wait till you do something? And God says, well, here's my answer. And he didn't like that answer, so he took up that cause. He was sort of defending his people. Again, I'm not saying that's definitely so, but this could be something connected to the meaning of his name. Other than this, we don't know anything about where he came from, his father's name, his hometown. We don't know anything about Habakkuk personally. All right, let's look at the date of the book. And sometimes it's helpful to know when a book was written. You don't have to know the date precisely to get the meaning of the book, but sometimes it is helpful. Most writers, if you look at commentaries or other studies, and again, that's not inspired. We admit that, but most Bible students will put Habakkuk's prophecy in the range of 612 to 605 BC, which is a real short window of time. I think that's a good range to look at for these reasons. 612, what happened in 612 BC, Bible history-wise? We've covered this in previous, not just in this quarter, but those of us who go through the curriculum here at Eastside, we should know some of these dates. 612, what happened in 612 BC? That's when Nebuchadnezzar overthrew or took control of Assyria. That's when Nineveh fell. So at that date and after, Assyria begins her very rapid decline as the dominant world power. So 612. So you see Babylon's rise and Assyria's fall. All right. So that's on one end of the scale, and I think that's a good date to use because for God to say, "I'm going to use Babylon to judge Judah," that's the problem, or that's the answer to your question, Habakkuk. That to me suggests that Babylon is on the rise, and she has already begun her ascension on the world ladder, if you will, and that would be after 612. 605 BC is the date of the first Jewish captives, when Nebuchadnezzar, after he wins the battle at Carchemish over Pharaoh Necho, He learns of his father's death, Nabopolassar. He's got to race back across the desert to Babylon to claim the throne before somebody else does. And on the way back from Carchemish, he goes through Judah, and who does he take captive? 605, he takes Daniel, at least Daniel and his friends. And so we know that's the case because in chapter 2 of this book, in verse 3, as well as chapter 3 and verse 16, the text tells us that Babylon has not yet done that. They've not yet taken those captives. So somewhere in this range, 612 to 605 BC, very, very short window of time. That's when, I believe, God called Habakkuk to prophesy with a very specific message, and Habakkuk even took his complaint to God, which we'll get to somewhat tonight. So if that's the case, I think it is, but if it's the case, then somewhere in that range, that has Jehoiakim on the throne in Judah. He would be king. And was he a good king or a bad king? 2 Kings 23 and verse 37 tells us that he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He was a bad king. So since that's the case, you pair that with Habakkuk's initial complaint to God in chapter 1 of this book. He's complaining about seeing what in Judah? All this wickedness and this unrighteousness. So they dovetail very nicely together. Okay? So I believe this is the time frame. Jehoiakim's on the throne. Wickedness is running rampant. Unrighteousness is everywhere. Justice is perverted, as we see in the first chapter of Habakkuk. And thus Habakkuk takes his complaint to God. Now, some other unique information about Habakkuk's prophecy. If this dating is correct, we're going to assume that it is, then that would have Habakkuk being the last prophet God called during the time period we know as the divided kingdom. And the chart that I showed you at the start of class, we'll pull this up again. See, right here is our section. These were the prophets here that prophesied before the fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah would be a contemporary to Habakkuk, but he's a major prophet. And of course, he was prophesying in Jerusalem. So then we go from here to the exilic and post-exilic periods. That's after Judah's fall. So Habakkuk was the last man God used before Judah's fall, and that ended the second kingdom. Of course, Israel's already gone by this time. So he was the last prophet that God used during this time period. Something else I think that's unique, and as you read through the book, I hope that you get a sense of this point. Usually, when God would call up a prophet and say to prophet so-and-so, go here, go there, give this message, the prophet is speaking on behalf of who? God. Jehovah says thus and so. And that would be the message for these people. So normally speaking, the prophet would speak to the people on behalf of the Lord. But as this book begins, it seems to be reversed, doesn't it? Habakkuk is speaking to the Lord on behalf of the people. Especially, he does that when he gets the answer to his first question. And he didn't like the answer. So he begins to reason with Jehovah. And maybe reason is not strong enough word. He questions God's use of the Chaldeans to judge the wickedness that's in Judah. So that seems to me to be a rather unique feature of the book. And again, as you go through the text, hope that you would appreciate that. All right. It has a very timely message. And this, of course, always needs to be our focus, not just when we study the prophets, which we are this quarter, but if we study anything from the first covenant, the Old Testament. What do we know the Bible says about the Old Testament? It's written for our learning. We need to learn these lessons. It's not our covenant. We agree with that statement, but we need to learn these things. And so it has a very timely message. Habakkuk, the man, the prophet, though he was inspired, he struggled with some things. And we need to see that in his message. Again, he struggles with all this wickedness. Turn to the first chapter of the book. You jump right in at verse 2. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and thou wilt not hear? I'm seeing all this. Why dost thou make me see iniquity? Cause me to look on wickedness. Destruction, violence are before me, strife, laws ignored, justice is never upheld, wicked around me everywhere. And he couldn't understand all this stuff I'm seeing. And his complaint was to God, why aren't you doing anything about this? You think he's the only person to ever have that kind of question in his mind? Well, of course not. Maybe we have the same kind of questions today. We live in a wicked society, don't we? And maybe we wonder, why isn't God doing anything about this? And so it's how can a righteous God ignore what is blatantly in front of us? And it's certainly this excess of wickedness certainly runs contrary to what His Word teaches. Why isn't something done about this? So it's a very timely message. And I'm simply just reminding us that Habakkuk's struggle is our struggle. And we can certainly identify with what he's going through emotionally and internally in his mind. And, we observe our world, don't we? We may wrestle with similar issues that he did, where wickedness appears to have the upper hand over righteousness and truth. And that's where we live. So, I always like, as best as we can determine, I think it's really helpful, whether it's a book from the Old or the New Covenant, try to find what the theme of the book is. Once we know a book's theme, then it seems to me that all the other text of the book will sort of wrap itself around and flow around that theme. The theme to Habakkuk is chapter 2 and verse 4, which we won't get to tonight, but that's the theme. What did God tell Habakkuk? After he says, I'll deal with Nebuchadnezzar, but as for you, speaking to Habakkuk, what did he say? The just or the righteous does what? You live by faith. And that's the theme of the book. The righteous man, now yes, all this unrighteousness out here, all this wickedness, yes, God says I'm very much aware of that. But the just man, the righteous man, he lives by faith. And that's the theme to Habakkuk. And I want to pause here and take the time to look at this real quickly. This is an oft-repeated statement found in the New Testament. Look at the book of Romans, chapter 1. Hold your place here. Turn to Romans, chapter 1. These are very familiar texts. And I believe not only is it the theme to Habakkuk, it's the theme to Romans. I believe that's so. Paul is dealing in the Roman letter and in the Galatian letter both, but Romans to a more lengthy extent. The issue is being justified on the basis of works of law, which the Jews were all over that. And Paul had to convince them that that was not so. And in doing that, he would also encourage the Gentiles who were being ostracized by Jewish brethren, both being Christians, but Jewish Christians versus Gentile Christians. And Paul was telling them, look, we're all in the same boat. So we know the very familiar verse, chapter 1 and verse 16, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God unto salvation for all them who believe. Then what's verse 17 say? For therein, that is the gospel, is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written. Then who's he quote? He quotes Habakkuk. The just shall live by faith. So if you want to be justified, it won't be on the basis of law. It'll be on the basis of your belief in God, your faith in God. Now, in a similar way, look at Galatians chapter 3. Galatians, the 3rd chapter. And again, as I said a moment ago, Galatians and Romans have a similar theme. They deal with a lot of the same issues, but Romans is way more in depth. You'll see there, look in verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. What was the curse, Paul? He quotes then, Cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to do them. That's the curse you're under. If you live by law, how much of it do you have to keep? All of it, and never make a mistake. And that's living under a curse, because no man can do that. So now verse 11. Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident. How is it evident? Who does he quote? The end of verse 11. He quotes Habakkuk. The just man lives by faith. Not by works of law, but by faith. God's always wanted man to live by faith. So here twice, in 2 letters, Paul reaches back and grabs this prophet's theme. The just man lives by his faith. All right? Then one more time here in Hebrews now chapter 10. I want us to see just how prevalent this is in a lot of the New Testament writings. Hebrews chapter 10. And look at verse 38. He's talking to Hebrew Christians who were being tempted to go back to this law. Okay? Paul and the writer is saying, don't do that. You need to endure. You need to stay with your new faith. Verse 36, for you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. Now, verse 37, he begins quoting who? Habakkuk. For yet in a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay, but my righteous one shall live by faith. So here's 3 occasions in the New Testament teaching of an inspired, either an apostle or the Hebrews writer, whoever he was by inspiration telling Christians the very same thing that God told Habakkuk. We see these things, we try to, and humans, we do that. We try to pass all what we see through our lenses, don't we? We try to rationalize things and make things make sense to us. Some things do make sense to us, don't they? But some things don't. And some things never will make sense to us, especially in the face of a wicked world and when we serve a very holy and just God. And so if we took a complaint to God like Habakkuk did, what would God tell us? What he told him. Listen, when we talk about living by faith or having faith in God, I've always thought this, and I think it even more than when I first thought about it years ago. What is the essence of, when we discuss living by faith, what are we really saying? We're talking about trust, aren't we? Either we trust God or we don't. And in issues like this, where the evidence around us seems to go against what we read from the Scripture or what we know about God as He reveals Himself through His Word, those things don't jive. They just don't mix. So we can't make sense of it. What else do we have? All we got is what? Faith. That's all we've got. And so God's just saying, look, I know about this stuff. I know this is going on, and I know that's going on. We know God has said in His Word numerous times in numerous ways, nothing escapes His notice. Or even the hairs on your head are numbered. And I've got less than you do. So that's how that goes. But God knows all these things. And He's basically saying, just trust me. Believe in me. Believe in what my Word says, and just trust me. And it'll work out the way I want it to. So I think it's a very timely message. Habakkuk went through some things that we go through. It's no different than us today. So today many want divine retribution, and they want instant justice. Things that happen. And there is some pretty wicked stuff in our world. There is. We know that. Pick up a newspaper if you still can find one, or turn on the internet news or the television, and we just see all this stuff. And we just, well, why is this stuff allowed to happen? Well, all this is under God's control. And we just need to remember. Another famous verse in this book, now chapter 2 and verse 20. We even have a hymn we sing. The Lord is where? In His holy temple. That means He's enthroned. God's enthroned. So since that's the case, what else does the prophet say? Let all the earth do what? Keep silence before Him. Remember your place. Let God run the world. Okay? God's in control. He'll get it right. So just remember that. And Habakkuk needed this lesson, but you know what? We need this lesson too. And we need the exact same kind of faith that Habakkuk needed and that God encouraged him to have in the face of what we see compared to the things that he saw. So I guess I got kind of wordy with this point, but it's just a timely message. And that's why it's so good to study the prophets from time to time. Because they're entirely relevant. Entirely up to date. All right. Here's a quick outline of the book. 3 chapters, 3 points. Chapter 1 discusses God's judgment of Judah. Well, not just chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 3. That's the discussion. Then in chapter 2 and verse 4, the rest of chapter 2, God's also now going to discuss judging who? Babylon. That will be discussed. And those two are connected because God is using one here to judge the former. And Habakkuk questioned that. He didn't see the reason for that or the rationale behind that. So that gets discussed in chapter 2. And then chapter 3, it's a beautiful prayer. And we'll look at that before our studies end on this book, especially toward the end, verses 17 and 18, and 19, those last three verses. It's just a beautiful thought. Viewing it in context of what's been talked about in the book, hope we'll gain some greater appreciation for it. Okay. Clicker's not working too well. So let's first now, for the balance of the time tonight, talk about this judgment upon Judah. So back to Habakkuk chapter 1 now. And let's just read the first 4 verses. We already read a few of them a few minutes ago, but let's look at it again now together. The oracle, or the burden, sometimes the versions say burden for oracle. The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and thou wilt not hear? I cry out to thee, violence, yet thou dost not save. Why dost thou make me see iniquity, and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists, and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored, and justice is never upheld, for the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore justice comes out perverted. What's that sound like? Our own day and time. It's exactly our culture. Now it can't be more apropos than that. So Habakkuk, he has a perplexity. And if any of you have any reference books, probably one of the classic commentaries to Brother Haley's, one he wrote years and years ago. And I like the way he arranged this first section. There's 2 perplexities on the part of the prophet. He has 2 things that are perplexing or puzzling him. So this is the first one. Habakkuk's first perplexity, verses 2 through 4. How long? Now, he isn't the only person in the Scripture to ever ask the question, how long? Others have asked it as well. Job asked it in Job chapter 7. And in Revelation chapter 6, those martyred souls under the altar, remember they asked, how long? Until we're going to be vindicated, that we'll be delivered, if you will. So it's an oft-repeated question that followers of God ask. And it's asked from the I don't want to say from the perspective of ignorance, but it's asked from a limited perspective. And the reason is obvious. We're limited by time and space, aren't we? I mean, we are. And God is above. He sees it all. He sees the entire corridor of time from the beginning to the end. And so we're here in this little bitty section, and we see this and that and the other thing, and we ask God, why or how long until this gets corrected? So what Habakkuk is doing is not safe. He's questioning. And really, he's even insinuating that God is indifferent to what's going on. He says, look, I see all this stuff. I see violence. I see iniquity. I see wickedness. I see destruction and violence. I see strife. I see justice perverted, bribery. The law's not upheld. It's ignored. People get away with murder, either figuratively or literally, however the case may be. I'm seeing all this. And behind that kind of a statement is an insinuation to God saying, don't you see all this too? And why aren't you doing anything about this? He says in verse 2, how long will I call for help and you don't hear me? He thought God was he had turned a deaf ear to it. And that's just getting dangerously close to being rebellious. I don't want to be too hard on the prophet, but that's a strong question. So God's supposed indifference is questioned. So he takes his case. Remember I said he spoke on behalf of the people to God. So there's his case to God. And here's God's answer. Verses 5 through 11. All right? Oscar, read for us, please, chapter 1, verses 5. This is God's first reply to the first perplexity.
Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly astounded. I will work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told you. For indeed I am raising up the Chaldeans, a better hasty nation, which marches through the earth of the earth, possess dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Judgment and dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses also are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the eagles. The chargers are at head. Cavalry constable fall. Fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. Thou come for violence, the faces are set like the eastward. They gather captives like the sand. The scoff at kings and princes are sworn by them. They deride every scoff. They heap up every mouth in season. In his mind change, which transgress, commits offense, striding in the sky.
All right. I meant to say this earlier, and I forgot, so it just now came to me. When you look at especially the first chapter, I think we have to acknowledge that there are changes of speakers. Although the text does not say, and then God said, and then Habakkuk said, but I think you see there's a change of speakers between verses 4 and 5. I think we can see that. And then we'll see it again between verses 11 and 12. So it's a dialogue between the prophet and God. Habakkuk speaks first, verses 1 through 4. Then God answers verses 5 through 11. And then Habakkuk picks up the case again, if you will, verses 12 of chapter 1 through verse 1 of chapter 2. That's the speeches. Okay? Now, Jehovah's not indifferent. He's anything but indifferent. You can't get more not indifferent than God. That's just not his nature. All right? And his solution to Habakkuk's challenging question is unexpected. How did he phrase it to Habakkuk? What did he say? He said, now be astonished. There's going to be a wonder. And then he says what? If what? If I told you, Habakkuk, what? You wouldn't believe me. Have you ever said that before to somebody? Now, you wouldn't believe this, but blah, blah, blah. We all say that. Because that would be the furthest thing from someone's mind. Well, that's the case here. God says, I'm on this, Habakkuk. I'm very much aware of the things you're talking about. And so he begins his reply by saying, look among the nations. Notice these verbs. Look, observe, be astonished, and wonder at this. This is something that's just so unusual that if you were told this, you wouldn't believe me. That's the long pre-answer. What's the basic answer to the prophet's question? He says, what were you going to do about all this wickedness? God's short answer is what? I'm going to send the Chaldeans. That's my answer. That's what he didn't believe. All right. Now, how does God describe them? That's the bulk of the reading that Oscar just did for us. How are they described? Terrible. They're not a nice bunch. All right. And for that matter, neither were the Assyrians. And they came in and they took Israel. They took the northern kingdom. Well, Babylon was cruel as well. Fierce and impetuous people, verse 6. They marched throughout the earth. They seized dwelling places which are not theirs. They're a conquering people. All right. Now, I think verse 7 is very, very important. Let's try to understand verse 7 as best we can. And this gets to the heart of what we said earlier about living by faith. God's providence. How deep is the issue of God's providence or the providence of God? It's way over our heads. All right. Verse 7. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Whose decision was it? And let's answer these carefully. Whose decision was it to use the Chaldeans? Well, it's God's. Whose decision was it for the Chaldeans to have this kind of character? It's theirs. God didn't make them this way. How many times have we seen in the Bible, and just think big picture for a moment, have we seen God providentially using a situation that might not seem to be right? For example, Joseph's brothers hated him. In a very familiar story. Okay? Well, did God make Joseph's brothers hate him? Well, of course not. That was on them. That was their choice. Joseph may have made it easier for them to hate him because he sort of rubbed that coat in their faces and talked about his visions and his dreams. All right? But their decision to hate Joseph was their choice. But could God use human hatred to further his plan? Where did he need Joseph? He needed him in Egypt. How could God have gotten Joseph in Egypt? Any way he wanted to. But see, that step had a part to play in that. Okay? Now, how can God do that? Well, that's God. He's in charge of all that. Same thing here. And that's Habakkuk's problem, as we'll see in a moment, in his second perplexity. Here's this wicked people. God describes them. This isn't Habakkuk talking. This is Jehovah, who knows the Chaldeans. He made the Chaldeans. But he's very aware of their character. And they're a brutal bunch. How can God use a brutal bunch like that to judge his own people? Well, that's God. He's in charge of that. But the character, we can't lay that at God's feet. God will judge them for their character. But they'll still play a part in his providential plan in the judgment of Judah's own sins. So he says, here's my unexpected solution. They're going to be my tool. I'm going to use them to judge the very thing you've been complaining about, Habakkuk, when we started this conversation a few minutes ago. All right? Anything else that you saw down through verse 11, verses 5 through 11, this lengthy reading that describes the Chaldeans? Anybody have a comment or question, some observation? Yes, Cameron. Mm-hmm.
God's people and things like that. You kind of hear that a lot nowadays. You wouldn't believe how bad it is now and things like that. I kind of just see a contrast between Habakkuk's attitude and what God tells him and today on. You wouldn't believe it if I told you.
Yes. That's why I said this is a very timely message. And it could be said today in our situations just like it was said to the prophet back in this day and time. All right. So there's the first perplexity. He's this puzzle he's got to work out in his mind. He takes his case to Jehovah, and then God's answer is through verse 11. Now, again, we'll see a change of speakers at verse 12. All right? So here's his second perplexity. And they're connected. So don't look at them separately. First perplexity, all this sin in Judah. God's answer, I'm sending Babylon. Now the second perplexity. Scott, read for us, please, verses 12 of chapter 1. 12 of chapter 1 through, let's stop at verse 17 just for the moment. So just finish the chapter out for us. Okay. How can a holy God make such a choice as this, is what he's saying. It begins in verse 12. Art thou not from everlasting? Aren't you the holy, eternal God, who's the very epitome of righteousness and goodness? Well, of course he is. But in Habakkuk's mind, that being the case, what does that rule out then? As he sees it. Well, you can't use the Chaldeans. That's wicked. You yourself, I mean, if we could put words in Habakkuk's mouth, it's as if he would be saying, you yourself just described them in such wicked terms, and now I've got to believe you when you say, I'm going to use them? How can you do that? How can a God make such a choice? I've got on the second bullet on the chart, he admits to knowing three truths. Look at verse 12. He knows these things. He knows, number one, God's nature. How does he describe it? Thou art from everlasting, and thou art holy. So he doesn't question that. Number two, what does he know? That short phrase next. Will not die. He knows that. Well, what if Judah, maybe I should ask this, why does he know that? Or how does he know that? What if Judah perished? I mean, Israel perished. She isn't a kingdom anymore. But what if Judah perished? Does that have any implications? Yes. God has promised that there would be the seed of David on the throne forever. The prophet knew that, I believe, by inspiration. So we can't have that happen. So he knows we won't be utterly wiped out like Israel was. We'll not die. He knows that. The third thing he knows is in the end of verse 12. Thou, O Lord, hast appointed them to judge. My version says, and has established them to correct. So he admits to these three truths. God's character is holy and he's eternal. He's everlasting. Number two, we won't die. We won't perish. And number three, he admits that they're God's tool. But despite knowing those three things, in his mind, he still has to harmonize what? This people that God has just described, how can you use them? God, how can you? It's almost as if he's saying, Jehovah, if you're using them, then you're sanctioning their behavior. There seems to be some tacit level of approval if you use them. And that's not the case at all. And that's where we get back into this business of God's providential use of either righteousness or wickedness to further his plan. And God can do that and still maintain his holy character. He always has, he always will. All right? So, despite having these questions, maybe even say he has doubts, look how this concludes. Well, before we get there, let's look at these statements as he described the Chaldeans that Scott read for us. Verse 13, thine eyes are too pure to approve evil. See again, he's saying if you use them, you're approving them. Well, that's not so, but that's what he thought. Thou canst look on wickedness with favor. You're God. You can't. That just seems to be the opposite of what you should be doing. He began discussing in verse 14 the sea. You see there? Why hast thou made men like the fish of the sea, and like creeping things without a ruler over them? Who is the fisherman now under discussion starting in verse 15? Who takes the role of the fisherman here? The Chaldeans do. Specifically, what man? Nebuchadnezzar. He's coming in and he'll just catch us like a bunch of sea creatures in a net. And we don't have a chance. And then he'll credit who? Look at verse 16. They'll offer sacrifice to their net. So Habakkuk is admitting that they'll give credit to who? Their idols, their gods. And again, the insinuation seems to be that God, if you use them, you're sort of backdoor in a backwards way sanctioning or approving their idolatry. Because that's who they'll give credit to. So there's just a whole lot going on here emotionally and intellectually with Habakkuk. And you just can't understand all this. Brent.
Thinking about the last part of verse 13. You know, in the first part of the chapter, Habakkuk is, aren't you going to do anything?
Yes.
God is supposed to know he's doing something. You're just gonna sit idly by and let this more wicked person do this?
He struggled with that. He just didn't see the rationale behind that. So he says all this. And I sure am glad the chapter or this section concludes the way that it does. Because if we stop right here, we wouldn't have a very good picture of Habakkuk. But look how this concludes. Scott ended at verse 17. Now, Scott, read for us chapter 2 and verse 1.
I will take my stand in my watch, station myself on the tower. Look out to see what you will say to me. What I will answer concerning.
So what's Habakkuk finally have to admit? Now he said some things that are challenging here, but he concludes by saying, well, all right, I'll stand on guard. I'll do my job, the job that God has called me to do. My version says, and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I am reproved. I'm wrong about this. I'll take my medicine, is what he's saying. And that's a good way to conclude this. He's questioned Jehovah's providential rule of the affairs of men. But what had God told him? Well, he hadn't told him yet. Well, we've already covered it in our introduction. Chapter 2 and verse 4. What's the theme? You'll live by faith. Now, you may not understand how I got all this stuff worked out. You may not see it. Okay? Like how certain men play chess. Some men play chess. They'll work 4 or 5 moves ahead in their mind. The board hadn't changed yet, but they've already got this stuff worked out. And I'm not saying that men are just pawns in God's... I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying God is able to work all these things out, and we're not privy to that information. We just don't know. The secret things belong to God, Moses wrote. But the things revealed belong to us. We can know what God has told us. But what he hadn't told us, what we're going to have to do. What's the essence of faith? Trust. We're going to have to trust him. And live by what he said. And let him be God, and we just serve him. So this is a great way to open this discussion between Habakkuk and Jehovah. Appreciate your comments. So get ready to jump back in chapter 2, the Lord willing, this coming Lord's Day morning when we resume our studies. We'll begin right here at this second reply from Jehovah. Thank you.
Good evening. Tonight I would like to talk for just a few moments about seeking Jesus. I want to start with some examples from the New Testament of people who sought after Jesus while he was physically here on the earth. These are taken from the Gospels, specifically Luke, and it features a couple of the miracles that are recorded for us. And the first one is Luke chapter 5 and verse 17. It came to pass on a certain day, as he was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by, which were come out of every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. And behold, men brought in a bed a man which was taken with a palsy, and they sought means to bring him in and to lay him before him. And when they could not find by what way they may bring him in because of the multitude, they went up on the housetop and let him down through the tiling with his couch into the midst before Jesus. So here you have a situation of a man that needed healing, and the people that were taking care of him know that Jesus has the power to heal, and they have the faith, but due to the crowd, they're desperate to get to Jesus, so they wind up letting him in through the roof. I've always been impressed with this story with these men and the effort they were willing to get to get to Jesus and the faith they showed. So immediately Jesus forgives the man's sins, but he debates with the Pharisees and scribes about that, and then he does heal the man specifically because of his faith. And a couple more instances where we see people that sought after Jesus while he was here on earth is the section in Luke 8 verses 41 to 56. a man named Jairus came to Jesus, and he begged him to come to his house due to his 12-year-old daughter that was on her deathbed, about to die. And while he was in this another crowd of folks, he's on his way to see this dying girl, a woman with an issue of blood who says she was 12 years old. Couldn't find anyone to heal her amongst the physicians. She comes up to Jesus in this crowd, and we don't know if she was trying to get to him to speak with him, or I assume I'm picturing a pretty large crowd, and she manages to touch the hem of his garment. And Jesus, he knows who touched him, but he asked who touched him because he could feel the power go out from him. And so she is healed. And then it picks back up with he goes back to the Jairus' daughter, and they say she's dead, and he goes and says she's not really dead, and when he gets there, he heals her and tells her to rise. So these are just examples of folks that knew Jesus had power, and they all had the faith to seek him out. And now, this was unique because Jesus was actually in the form of man, and he now has not been on the earth for 2,000 years, but we also need to seek him spiritually, similarly to the way these people sought him out when he was here. They could seek him physically because he was a man and he was on earth, and I believe that we can, it makes me believe they sought him out specifically to be healed. He realized their faith, and he did forgive their sins, but I think he was seeking them. They were seeking him to be healed of their physical ailments. But we need to seek him out now that he's in heaven. We need to seek him out so he can heal us spiritually. We can obviously we can pray to God through Christ to intercede with our physical matters, but our primary need for Jesus and the reason to seek him now is for our soul's salvation. How do we seek him now that he's in heaven with the Father? We need to get to know him. And how do we get to know him? We have to read his word and study the Bible. And we need to, as we emphasize here at Eastside, to know the whole Bible story, because it starts as early as Genesis with the first prophecy of Jesus in Genesis 3. To fully know Jesus, we need to know about Abraham and the promises made to him, and we need to know about David and the lineage to the throne that Christ would eventually sit on. And the bottom line is to seek Jesus, we need to read and study the Bible, and this is how we can build our faith. As it says in Romans, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing the Word of God. And this leads to the final point, which is to truly seek Jesus, we must not only learn the Word, but we have to obey. Seeking Jesus is more than reading the Bible and attending church services. If we're truly seeking after him, as those people in the miracles, we must obey his word. Jesus said himself in John 14, verse 23, "If a man love me, he will keep my words, and my Father will love him, and we will come unto him and make our abode with him." Can't be any clearer than that. If we love him, we will do what he says. And in James, the first chapter, it says, "But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if any be a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed indeed. So this leads us to the ultimate way to seek Jesus is to obey the command from Mark 16:16, where he says, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned." When we're baptized, we are buried with Christ and we become one of his disciples. If you need to be baptized tonight, or if you're a Christian who needs to make a public confession of sin in your life, come forward as we stand and sing.